We've been making these kinds of videos for a few years now, and in doing the research for them, we've stumbled across all manner of oddities from Games Workshop's past. Some of these we've even turned into videos, like Space Fleet or Fiend Factory. Basically, what we're trying to say is that it's rare that someone suggests a topic that we've never heard of at all. However, after our last episode, we got this comment from a gentleman called Brandon Harris. Have you guys ever thought about doing a video on Laserburn / Imperial Commander, since they are kind of the real precursors to 40k? And our first reaction was, what the hell is Laserburn?
Well, it turns out that that is an interesting question to answer. So, greetings Sensualons, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
Buckle up, friendos, we're about to go on a deep dive.
Laserburn is a sci-fi skirmish wargame written by Brian Ansell and released in 1980. It has some interesting connections to Warhammer 40,000, as well as equally interesting connections to some other games, but don't worry about those right now. Forget about those blurry images, stop trying to figure out what they are. As you may be able to tell, this isn't an original copy of the rulebook. The originals were A5 in size, and this copy is both A4 and brand new. This is because, at least at the time we're making this video, you can buy reproductions from the Alternative Armies website. You can even buy new castings of the old models from there. That's not a sponsored thing, by the way, it's just the website you can buy them from. Although, if they do make some extra sales from us making this video and they want to send us some Blackguard minis, well, they've already got our address. So, as we mentioned a moment ago, Laserburn, and since it's British, please note that it's spelled with an S, except when it's not, is a skirmish game designed to be played with between 12 and 20 models a side, inspired in part by some Wild West games. Although it is a game in its own right, with its own background, it was also written with the intention that it could simply be used to resolve combat in whatever sci-fi RPG you happen to be running. And many of the rules were written with the idea that you may have a GM or umpire as well as the players. But much like Rogue Trader, we get the impression that many players didn't really bother with that.
Characters in the game only have 3 stats. Weapon skill, their chance of hitting with a ranged weapon. Combat skill, their chance of hitting in close combat. And initiative, their speed of reaction, awareness, that kind of thing. Although there are standard values you can pick from, you can also roll for them. So a stock conscript would have an 80% chance of hitting with a ranged weapon, but if you roll for it, they could have anywhere between a 30 to 130% chance of hitting. Also, the simplicity of the stats means you can present a character's stat line as just the 3 numbers. Models of sufficient capability also have a chance of having extra skills like being ambidextrous, being able to hit specific areas on a target easier, being good with jetpacks, etc. We're not going to get too deep into how the game itself works, because yeah. So here's a rough overview. On any given turn, all the models move in initiative order, with a character's initiative being modified by various factors. Models can then do their actions, most actions taking a third of their turn. Actions are things like firing a weapon, drawing a weapon, reloading, etc. To fire, you have to be pointed in the right direction and then roll a d100 against your weapon skill, which is subject to a host of modifiers. Which is why the hit percentage in model stats can be well over 100, since it's usually going to be vastly reduced. If 2 models find themselves within 1 centimeter of each other, you can do a melee attack, and that works very similarly.
Working out the damage gets a little convoluted. First you have to figure out where the shot hits, then work out the penetration chance, which is based on the weapon type and armour of the model being hurt. Then you roll on that and work out what it does, with a variety of different damage possible depending on what you hit and where. From straight up killing, to permanently blinding a character, to just them dropping the weapon. There's also a morale system and a host of smaller considerations around using specific weapons and armour, but that's the basic gist. It's pretty simple in theory, but there's definitely a few bits in there that feel like they're part of some nefarious plot to sell calculators. Although if you want to play a quicker or larger version of the game, there's also a section for simplified rules, which streamlines or removes a bunch of stuff, reducing the complexity a tad. Oh, and there's also rules for drugs.
Drugs of every description are readily available. They are one of the most popular forms of home entertainment.
The 3 drugs available are Sting, which makes you better at, well, most things honestly, but you have to be careful not to get addicted. It is apparently pretty wonderful stuff. I think Brian wants us to do drugs. There's also Steam, a drug which makes you very, very fast, and Cringe, which thankfully doesn't turn people into a mean-spirited YouTube compilation video, but instead robs someone of their identity, turning them into virtual automatons.
But the actual game aside, I'm sure most of you are wondering what connections Laserburn has to 40k. Well, the obvious one is that its writer, Brian Ansell, who was running Citadel Miniatures at the time, would become the owner of Games Workshop in the mid-80s, as well as being one of the writers for Warhammer Fantasy's first edition. A few of the other people who worked on the expansions for Laserburn, more on those later, also ended up doing work for GW at some point, like Richard Halliwell and Tony Ackland. However, there are many elements from the game itself that are far more notable. Just browsing the weapons and armour, you'll find many things that are familiar. There's bolt guns of multiple types, many of which are sometimes referred to as bolters, a converter beam projector that sounds suspiciously similar to a conversion beam projector, needle guns, hand flamers, and power gloves, a weapon later renamed to Power Fists in 40k, presumably because it was marginally less silly than Power Glove.
On top of the weapons, there's also power armour that features a backpack that looks a little familiar. In fact, there's a concept sketch for 40k that does look a little like a midpoint between Space Marine armour and Laserburn Imperial armour. There's also a heavier version of power armour called Dreadnought armour. In 40k terms, it's actually closer to Terminator armour than a Dreadnought, but to be fair, the other name for Terminator armour is Tactical Dreadnought armour. Plus, outside of Laserburn and 40k, Dreadnought isn't really a name applied to any kind of armour or walker usually. Normally it just refers to boats.
Then we have the Law. The main faction is the Imperium, a space empire that originates from Earth, has long since passed its peak, and is well along its way down the long, bloody slide into barbarism. They are brutal, imperialistic, have an imperial inquisition, and there is, indeed, an emperor. An emperor of mankind, you could say. I suppose you could also interpret the Merchant Barons as being like rogue traders if you squint a bit, and the Death Warriors have a kind of chaosy vibe to them. But equally, they also look like any given knockoff action figure bad guy. Like 40k, religious fanaticism rears its head in Laserburn. The greatest enemy of the Imperium are the Redemptionists, sometimes referred to as the Red Redemption. Religious zealots made up mainly of African and Near Eastern groups, coming from the Dark Worlds and devoted to Allah, the, quote, Lord of the Fiery Hells. Yikes.
Given the time period and the sorts of works of fiction that inspired games like this, we don't think that there's any actual malice involved in this, but it was at best pretty ignorant. But we are white non-Muslims, so if you aren't that and you feel differently about it, then that is wholly understandable. I will say, however, that the fact that the Masters of the Inner Circle, people so fanatical that they have their flesh flayed from their bodies and replaced with a metal carapace, are referred to as pretty tough hombres, is quite funny. Now, of course, we cannot definitively say that all the things that ended up in 40k were a direct inspiration or reference to Laserburn. Some of this stuff did appear in other works, and it's not like we can read Rick Priestley's mind.
Not yet.
But I think it's safe to say that considering how many elements show up in both, that the person who owned the company at the time wrote Laserburn, and that Priestley does tend to mention the game when interviewed about Rogue Trader, that some of Laserburn probably did end up in old Warty Thou.
As is the way of these things, there were a handful of expansions released for Laserburn. Imperial Commander, which came out in 1981, wasn't an expansion at all. It was a whole new game set in the same universe and using the same models. So it's probably a strange thing to lead this section with, but I mean, try not to think about it. This one was meant for larger mass combat games of around 50 models per side, rather than the smaller skirmish affair that was Laserburn. Forces of the Imperium from 1982 elaborated on the stuff used by the Imperium, adding more snippets of lore and further establishing their armour does indeed make them look like Sontarans. It also has a guide for painting your minis' uniforms and armour in a lore-friendly way, which includes denoting things via the stripe on the helmet and the rims of the shoulder pads, which seems a little familiar for some reason, can't quite figure out why. I'm sure it's nothing, don't think about it. Robot from 1983 added, well, robots. These came in a wide variety, from robo-turrets to domestic robots to Judge Dredd robots to what is basically a tank.
And finally, we have Advanced Laserburn and Aliens, written by Tony Ackland, which, perhaps unsurprisingly, elaborated on the rules and added some aliens. I do love how the titles of these expansions are also on the nose. It lets you know where you are, you know? Characters are given new stats: intelligence, intuition, dexterity, agility, vision, endurance, regeneration rate, strength, mass, and power, with some slightly disappointing gendering of stats since it's 1983. These are then all combined in various ways to generate the simple 3-stat stat line from before. We also get rules that add new dimensions to the injury mechanics, elaboration on the combat, vehicle rules, androids, and the xenological difference chart.
What? Actually, that's a good time to mention something. A lot of older tabletop game rules have this quirk where they're more vague and convoluted than their modern equivalents, but they also rarely use useful examples to show you how the rules work either. This leads to games like Laserburn feeling way more complicated than they actually are, since even when you do comprehend a rule, you don't get much confirmation that you're applying it correctly. And the full explanation of it might be split up into 4 different sections at opposite ends of the rulebook. It's a thing that most modern games tend to have rectified, thankfully, but it's still something to bear in mind should you choose to look at systems from this sort of era. Oh, and the xenological difference chart is to work out how easily a character can use a weapon made by a different alien race, just in case you were wondering. We think. I mean, we're pretty sure anyway.
I suppose there's also the "and aliens" bit to talk about too. In this book they introduce 5 races with names of varying pronounceability. The Mrurs, a mysterious race of cat people who refuse to ever fight their own kind. The Thulgs, lizard men whose thick skin counts as light armour. The Centulons, who are centaur lions like the ones in Quest for Glory. You know, lion taurs. The Sthix? Sthix? I'm gonna go with Sthix. Another race of lizard men who value honour and bravery and do not like lasers for some reason. And finally, we have the Frug. What's a Frug? This is a Frug. They're vaguely xenophobic, cowardly frog people, we'll let you think up your own racist frog joke there, that eschew melee combat for highly advanced ranged weapons. They also have an alliance with the race of alien lizard men that I already forgot how I chose to pronounce their name, not out of friendliness, but more because they just weren't able to kill each other and distrust everyone else just a little bit more than they distrust each other. The bedrock of all strong friendships.
Advanced Laserburn also moves the timeline on a little bit. By this point, the Imperium and Red Redemption have waned in power, and the major players are now large corporations, making it very cyberpunk indeed. Since they're quite fun, let's take a closer look at the official Laserburn models. The game can be played with 25mm or 15mm scale models, with these official ones being of the 15mm variety, which puts them somewhere between epic and old 40k scale, although due to the size creep they are positively dwarfed by something like a Primaris. The one contemporary review we could find was from a 1982 issue of Space Gamer that praised the quality of the minis but said that the vehicles were a bit rough. And although we don't have any of the vehicles, we can confirm that the detail on the ones that we do have is pretty good considering the age of the sculpts and their size. But there's definitely some in the range that are not quite up to that quality. I guess armour is always going to come out looking a little bit better than faces at this scale.
Their size makes them quite interesting to paint since they're small, but they're not small enough to have to really start sacrificing detail like epic scale minis did. It makes them a fun challenge to paint if you're used to larger models. These ones do all have a base built into them, but it seems standard practice to mount them on a larger base for stability. We used pennies, but other solutions are available, as indeed are other currencies, I suppose. Also, this is completely irrelevant, but we just wanted to show you the cover art of the issue of Space Gamer that we found the Laserburn model review in, just because it's really fun and colourful. Actually, speaking about art, you might have noticed that the art in these books is a little, inconsistent. Some of it is pretty basic, whilst other bits are very in line with the sort of artwork that you'd find in, say, White Dwarf around this time. Quite a lot of it has this sort of 70s science fantasy vibe that's a lot of fun, even if it does sometimes feel at odds with the other proto-grimdark elements. To our knowledge, there isn't any official artwork that's in colour. I coloured the one that you've seen in this video just so we'd have something to use as a background, although that sort of thing isn't particularly unusual for a game released around this time period.
Also, this lady from the Forces of the Imperium book looks eerily similar to my old 40k Inquisitor OC. And this book was published 5 years before I was born. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that information. Now, some of you may be wondering if by covering Laserburn we're breaking the theme of only talking about things produced or licensed by Games Workshop in this series. After all, despite its part in 40k's origins, neither the game nor the models were produced by Games Workshop or Citadel. Well, though we're sure that one day we will absolutely cover something with no connection to GW, today is not that day. For you see, Laserburn would, in a fashion, be released by Games Workshop a decade after its initial publication. Starting in issue 130 and spanning over 6 issues, a game called Confrontation was published in White Dwarf between 1990 and 1991. Confrontation was Laserburn, more or less. It was just rewritten to be easier to read and given a grim dark coat of paint to make it into a game set in the 40k universe. This isn't anything sneaky either, they straight up told you this in the first article, although the name Laserburn isn't explicitly used. It also reveals that Laserburn was originally intended as a World War II game, so that's interesting. Confrontation is most well known as the precursor to Necromunda. Since it's a skirmish game where you play as gangs set on the hive world of Necromunda, it's an understandable comparison.
See, there was a reason why there was a Necromunda background behind me the whole time. We know what we're doing.
They also never finished publishing the rules for it, leaving the game in an incomplete state. We've read that this was probably due to Ansel selling his shares and leaving the company around this time.
Not much of Confrontation ended up in Necromunda proper outside of the gallons and gallons of lore written for it, but this does mean that Laserburn is part of the history of 2 separate GW game systems. And whilst we're talking about long-running series that carry some of Laserburn's DNA, the guy who wrote the robot expansion was named Ian Terry. Terry would go on to video game design and would be involved in the 1988 game Laser Squad, initially released for the ZX Spectrum by Mythos Games, then Target Games. It is said that Laser Squad's mechanics were heavily influenced by Laserburn, which makes sense since Ian Terry worked on both. Where it gets interesting is that many of the mechanics from Laser Squad would later end up in Mythos' most well-known title, UFO Enemy Unknown, a game that our US viewers may know better as XCOM UFO Defense. So yeah, despite only really having one edition 40 years ago, Laserburn's influence is remarkably wide, and at the very least it makes it more fitting when you install Warhammer 40,000 mods in XCOM 2. Both series do share some of the same heritage after all. Actually, I imagine that if you installed said mods whilst you were playing a game of Necromunda with miniatures from the XCOM board game, then you'd complete some kind of ritual that would summon Brian Ansel into your house to discuss why you should probably do some drugs.
So, that was Laserburn. Thank you to Brandon, whose random comment ended up spiralling into this whole video. Of all the old games we've mentioned in this series, this has got to be one of the easiest to play in the modern day. Not because it's simple, I mean we all saw those old charts, but since everything you need is still in print.
So if this seems interesting to you, then yeah, go for it. There are apparently people still playing it.
And if you have friends that are willing to play a game with you with a rule sheet like this in the year of 2020, then you take those friends and you hold them close, and you thank God every single day they are in your presence, and you let them know that they are the only thing that keeps a world like this going.